Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca Kariuki and I'm a researcher based at the Nelson Mandela African Institute of Science and Technology in Tanzania and the University of York in the United Kingdom. I would like to start my presentation by thanking the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society for providing me with an opportunity to visit the center as a researcher, and also I would like to thank RCC for providing me with this opportunity to present my research in this lunchtime colloquium. For my presentation today, I would like to talk about northern Tanzanian futures as envisioned by stakeholders who live and work in northern Tanzania. The specific area of interest is the northwestern part of Tanzania. It's an area characterized by heterogeneous landscapes ranging from mountains to forests to savannas and grasslands. This heterogeneous landscape provide numerous ecosystem services to various populations that live in the area. The area also is rich in biodiversity of both plants and animals and supports a large biomass of ungulates and herbivores. Because of the high biodiversity of the area, the eastern parts of the area are under some form of protection and they form a significant proportion of the area. And when you look at the slide, these areas are represented by the red outline line on the map. In addition, climates in the area are quite variable and they shape the livelihood patterns in the area, such that when you look at the western part of the area, which are close to Lake Victoria, they are wetter and they're mainly used for agriculture, while the eastern parts, which are drier, receive an average rainfall of about 500 to 600 millimeters of rainfall, and they're used mainly for wildlife conservation and livestock. Pastoralism in the eastern parts have been used for at least the last 4,000 years and contribute to a significant portion of revenues in the households in the area and even in the entire Tanzania economy. On the other hand, the western part, which is mainly an agricultural area, it's characterized by smallholder farms, which mainly involve clearing of natural vegetation to make room for smallholder farms, which are used for subsistence crops and also for cotton production, which is a cash crop in the area. And most of the farms there rely on rainfall for their production, but also in the area we have bits and portion of areas which use irrigated agriculture, and this normally occur in areas where the land is close to water bodies. Agriculture is also an important contributor to revenues in the area, and it supports about 80% of the people who live in the area. Besides livestock grazing and agriculture, we also have wildlife conservation, which is also very important in the area. And when you look at East African countries, generally a big proportion of their land is under some form of conservation. And in Tanzania specifically, 40% of the area is under wildlife conservation, and the protected areas also vary in terms of their management and in terms of what is allowed in the protected area. For instance, when you look at Tanzania, you have the national parks, which receive the highest priority of protection from the government, and these areas only allow non-consumptive use of wildlife. On the other hand, protected areas that are run by the communities also conserve wildlife, but they also allow livestock grazing and agriculture, and also in some cases they also allow wildlife hunting. Of our area of interest, we also have the Serengeti National Park, which is quite expansive, covers about 15,000 kilometers squared, and it's renowned for migration of about 2 million animals every year between Kenya and Tanzania. It's also part of the study area and also brings in a lot of revenue to the Tanzanian government, because 50% of the tourists who visit Tanzania most of the time end up visiting the Serengeti area. Other aspects that are of interest in the study area is the Ngorongoro Lengai UNESCO Global Geopark. It's one of the 2 geoparks in the African continent, and within this geopark, it's known for its geological diversity, which also includes a volcanic mountain and at least 35 conservation cultural heritage sites, which on the map they are shown with the small black triangles. Additionally, the area is also rich in mineral occurrences, and some of the mines in the area are active while others are dormant. And for the active mines, we have smallholder artisanal miners, and we also have large-scale miners. Taken together, the northern Tanzanian landscape, which I also refer to it as the wider Serengeti ecosystem, it can be viewed as a multifunctional ecosystem where you have the wetter areas, which are on the western side, are mainly used for agriculture. They have fewer wildlife and they have lesser protected areas. And on the other hand, the drier areas, which are on the eastern side, are pretty much used for wildlife conservation and pastoralism and have more protected areas. And because of the high occurrence of the protected areas in the eastern part, they also have a lot of development in terms of the eastern part has better access to social facilities and infrastructure, and the population density in the area is also higher compared to the western part. To meet the demands of this multifunctional ecosystem, there's a lot of land use, land cover change that has been happening over the last few decades, with the most common one being conversion of natural vegetation to agricultural areas. And that means when this conversion happens, there's a lot of fragmentation of wildlife dispersal areas and livestock grazing areas, and sometimes this has detrimental consequences on the ecosystem because of the overgrazing and also the landscape fragmentation that also happens when that occurs. And this slide just shows you the expansion of agriculture. When you look at the map, you have the pink areas which depict agricultural areas, and they go all the way until the boundaries of the protected areas, which are shown by the black lines. And then when you look at the vegetation inside the protected areas, it's either the yellow color or the green color or the brown color, which pretty much shows it's either a forest, a grassland, or a shrubland. And this only happens when the area is protected, but on the outside you see agriculture. And this brings in another level of the aspect of protection. To what extent does it drive land use and land cover change in the area? Having all this background in place, then the key sustainability challenge for this presentation is: how can wildlife conservation, agriculture, production, livestock grazing, and development be balanced now and in the future, considering we have different players who have different needs? We've got farmers, we have pastoralists, we have conservationists, and they're also entrepreneurs. And also considering the climates are changing, and then there are different governance structures across the ecosystem. We have different cultures. We also have different social-economic factors. And also we have sustainability targets that the government of Tanzania needs to meet, and also some sustainability targets which are also from the international settings, such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the African Union Agenda 2063. Also bearing in mind the population has also been increasing, and it's projected to continue increasing throughout the century. So to address this question, I'm using a framework, a participatory scenario modeling framework. It's called Kesho. Kesho is a Swahili word meaning tomorrow. And pretty much what the framework does, it combines stakeholder views with spatial modeling to create scenarios of future land use change. And it has 4 steps which involve stakeholders and researchers. So the first step involves setting the scenario. Pretty much like from what year will the change expected to occur until what year? So in our case, we are looking at the change from 2018 to 2030, and then from 2030 to 2063. So 2030 and 2063 was selected as the time horizons for this work because we wanted to align the scenarios developed with the Sustainable Development Goals Agenda for 2030 and the African Union Agenda for 2063. After setting the scenarios, the stakeholders then create narratives of the conditions that will have to be in place for change to happen from the base year, which in this case is 2018, to the time horizon, which is 2030 and 2063. And then the third step involves modeling, and pretty much what this involves taking the stakeholders' views and combining it with secondary data sources, which is mainly quantitative data, and to create spatial output of future land use change. And then finally, the fourth step involves disseminating all the information that has been gathered to the stakeholders, where they validate and also give their feedback. So my team and I ran a series of workshops across northern Tanzanian landscape, And the workshop targeted stakeholders who range from social scientists to environmental scientists to business people, the local community, mainly comprised of pastoralists, farmers, hunter-gatherers. We also have non-governmental organizations, government offices, and also business people. So the idea behind the workshop was pretty much to engage this diverse group of people to try and envision how the landscape has been changing from the past to the present and use that information to project into the future. And so the workshop started by the stakeholders trying to recreate what they think about the past. And this involved exercises that were talking about what reminded them of their past, how past landscapes look like, how past livelihoods and also climates look like. So the idea for the stakeholders to discuss the past was pretty much for the stakeholders to get an appreciation of time and how it influences environmental change, and also to see how past landscapes were changing and how in turn that affected the present change that we see and how that can be used to inform the future. And then from the various perspectives that the stakeholders ended up discussing, most of them associated the past with abundance of wildlife. Some of them associated it with climate, infrastructure, and there are really, really diverse answers. But the thing is, they got to see the appreciation of how you can actually use past insights and how that contributes to present and probably how that can inform the future. And then having reconstructed the past, the next exercise for the stakeholders was pretty much to identify trajectories for different futures in their area of interest, drawing from the insights that they gathered or they talked about when they were trying to reconstruct what past landscapes look like and how that drove the present land use changes and experienced in their area. And so one of the scenarios that the stakeholders came up with for the area of interest was a scenario they named Parks and People scenario. So under this scenario, the stakeholders pretty much envisioned a future where they will have people coexisting together with wild animals. But for this to happen, the stakeholders felt that there needed to be proactive political leadership in sustainable development and climate change mitigation intervention. They also felt that there needed to be effective land use plans and also a very conscious decision by the government to secure land for wildlife conservation. On the other hand, the stakeholders also came up with a scenario which they called the dying giant scenario. So pretty much under this scenario, they felt like it will be characterized by lack of climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies, and there will also be ineffective management of natural resources, and also the land use plans will pretty much be non-existent, and if they will be there, they will pretty much be ineffective. Following the description of the scenarios, the stakeholders also came up with narratives, and some of the things that stood out from the two scenarios. For the Parks and People, they envisioned that by 2030, the main land use patterns will be driven by increasing population growth, and this will lead to concentration of wildlife within the park protected areas boundaries, and outside the protected areas, the main land use will pretty much continue to be what it is, which is transformation of natural habitats to agricultural areas. And then by 2030, still under the Parks and People scenario, they envisioned there will be concerted efforts by Tanzanian authorities to ensure there is minimum encroachment in the protected areas. However, they felt like that protected areas which are managed by the community will continue to shrink because of encroachment, despite the efforts by the government. For the dying giant scenario, the stakeholders felt that by 2030, the intensive use of key resource areas such as forest and water bodies will lead to land degradation, food insecurity, and also land use conflict. And by 2030, the impacts from climate change will be more severe than what they are in 2030. And considering there is no political will in coming up with climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy, what that means, most people will be less dependent on wildlife-related livelihoods, and also agricultural production and livestock production will also be affected. So the final step of the framework that I was using was to combine the stakeholder information with quantitative data to establish the extent and the type of land use change in the area. So under the Parks and People scenario, based on what the stakeholders provided at the workshop and what other data sources say, it shows that agriculture will continue expanding, and mainly it will expand on the western parts of the area. These are which are not protected, and by 2063 the expansion will also continue in some of the protected areas, and mainly the highland forests on the eastern parts, which are protected by the local communities. On the other hand, looking at the extent of land use change in the future from the dying giant scenario, the simulation showed that the most important land use change that will happen in the future in 2030 will be the conversion of grasslands to woodlands, and mainly will be driven by increasing livestock production, which is uncontrolled. And by 2063, the expansion of the woodlands will continue, and on top of that, there'll be smallholder increase in some of the woodland protected the areas where there is woodland and there's no protection. In conclusion, through the participatory scenario development process, the stakeholders were able to achieve a sense of ownership for the scenarios they developed. There was also social learning, where the stakeholders came together and exchanged knowledge based on their diverse expertise. There was also understanding of the scenario outputs that they generated. In addition, the co-produced scenarios gave a great likelihood of northern Tanzanian landscape to meet some of the targets of the National Development Agenda for Tanzania, and also the SDG targets and the African Union development targets. I'd like to appreciate the support I received from the people listed here and the organization listed here. I'm grateful for that. And thank you very much for listening.